As I've been poking around in the National Park Service offerings, I've started to notice trends, the sort of things that become parks and monuments and stuff. Some things are obvious. This hole in the ground or this giant rock is unavoidable and worth keeping as something all people can come visit and enjoy for its sheer magnificence. But then there's a bit of leaning into fashion. What is considered interesting and worth preserving? Human effort, sure. Rock fortresses, battlefields, homes of interesting people, places where particularly poor choices were made about how to treat people, and places where animals lived or used to live. But then there is the interesting question. What about places that have hosted people for millennia? These places that are no longer important to most of us modern folks, but were an essential part of how the world hung together before engineered roads, before engines, before refrigeration and long-distance communication. Places that hosted the passing through and sustenance of people of all sorts. And so this week we look at a monument to some areas that facilitated this different way of getting around the country. A crossroads and a place that dependably provided food. The Natchez Trace is just such a place. It's a trail through the states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and it moves through hardwood-covered mountains, lowland forests, prairies, and wetlands that make up the areas on the land side of the lively river deltas and rich farmlands of the southeast that have sustained people living in these areas for thousands of years. It's been a highway for foot traffic of the earliest inhabitants of the Americas as they moved and traded north and south, but it also was important for the movement of colonists, settlers, and enslaved people choosing a different life for themselves and their descendants. Portions of the Natchez Trace have functioned as a game trail, as cattle drive, as pig drive, as road for human migrations. But now it's a place to see the wilderness a little bit like our 19th century American counterparts were just starting to see America. The variety and distance of this trail hints at just how big a place the country was to become and how far one could go, and how many different landscapes one can see while not really going that far in the whole wide country America was growing up into. So if you're looking for a less busy, less fashionable, and so much less crowded, and in modern terms, ruined national park destination that gives you access to natural wonders, check out what the Natchez Trace Trail can offer you, both as a glimpse at the peace and quiet and beauty of the past, but also the wonders the National Park Service is helping us hold on to for the future. Episode 102, Gumbo and Jambalaya, the 3 Flags Day versions. Hello and welcome to the history of American food. This week I'll be looking at what real cuisine from New Orleans was before it was a place awash in plastic beads and sketchy Airbnb deals. In other words, what did the 2 quintessentially Louisiana foods look like when New Orleans became an American city? If you want to find out, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that there is more than one thing in the world called gumbo. And the very first thing that was and is gumbo is what we in America now call okra. Unlike so many things, corn, tomatoes, peanuts, potatoes, chocolate, that were American first and then have come back to us by their trips through other cultures, okra is an African plant that came to the Americas with Africans. Just like everything else that grows in lots of places, it has different names depending on where you pick it up. And while we think of one sort of okra when we think about it at all, there are actually hundreds of sorts of regional varieties of okra. Now, these members of the mallow family, yes, as in marshmallows, all have big, gorgeous flowers, which makes sense because this family also includes the hibiscus. And okra didn't just travel to America. You'll find it in Indian food as the ingredient called bindi. It's common in Caribbean food, and it will show up in some coastal South American food and in Mediterranean dishes as well. And for what it's worth, the thing that is called Chinese okra is actually not okra. It's a relative of the zucchini and cucumbers. And so it is the plant gumbo, or okra, that gives its name to the flavorful stew, gumbo. The version that started showing up in the 18th and 19th century writing and then cookbooks is a long way away from the version we argue about now on the internet. The first mentions I saw in cookbooks, which meant high up on the social ladder, was in Mary Randolph's The Virginia Housewife. While it was published in 1824, her cooking heyday was actually in the 1790s. So her recipes, often cross-referenced with the notes of Thomas Jefferson's garden, are a very good gauge of what was in during this period between 1776 and 1815. The thing Mary Randolph labels gumbs is actually a dish of buttered okra pods, but she also has a recipe of stewed okra, tomatoes, and onions with butter, salt, and pepper, which you could practically go pick up a version of right now in the canned goods section of certain grocery stores today. And she also has a recipe for something she calls okra soup, incidentally spelled O-C-H-R-A. And this is the first look at a published recipe for the gumbo of this period. Of greater interest, these dishes are labeled as West Indian. That is, dishes from the Caribbean islands where many of the people living on Virginia and South Carolina plantations had relatives and business acquaintances. To her, gumbo and okra were not New Orleans dishes. So the roots of gumbo lies as much in Barbados and Jamaica as it does in New Orleans. In their African existence, gumbos and okra stews had a particular role at meals. As I've mentioned on and off, everywhere around the world, it was common to find some combination of starch and stew, more or less. Europeans and other wheat-centered cultures tended towards a pairing of stew and bread, sometimes risen breads and sometimes flat bread. But let's face it, foul madames, which is an Egyptian fava bean stew with pita, and split pea soup eaten with a crusty loaf are just real darn close in the grand scheme of things. In the Americas, you would find people supping upon potatoes or similar root vegetables, or maybe cornmeal dumplings or pones, or even whole hominy with their stews. A cruise over to the rice areas of Africa and Asia would show you a wide variety of bowls of plain rice topped with meat and or vegetable mixtures, which gets us to the gumbo or okra stews of West Africa. They are half of that region's typical combination of stew and starch. But this time the starch is pounded yams. In what is today Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, and the Congos and Angola, in all these places, you will find a wide variety of yams cooked and pounded and prepared for eating. At mealtimes, the sticky and slightly stringy starch is made into balls and then dipped into thick, clinging, and often highly spiced stews. The modern catch-all term for these are swallows, as one swallows the pounded yam with the clinging stew. And the mucilaginous, sticky, slippery nature of the okra made it an especially good addition for this sort of stew. It caused the stew to stick to the yam balls and help the morsel go down. But just as the sweet potato and sometimes pumpkins would take over in place of yams, what went into the spiced African stews would also change as they traveled with their cooks to the New World. And as new cooks took up the flavors, how the stew was eaten would also change, as would feelings about the slippery stickiness of the okra. In the tropical regions, literally between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, where gumbos originated, okra is a perennial plant. It just continues to grow year in, year out. And so pods would often be available for including in these stews for large parts of the year. And the same tended to be true in the Caribbean gardens that were the next stop for gumbos. Fun fact, there is a gumbo style in the Dutch island of Curacao to this day, which leans on salt beef and local fish, which is a particular combination of ingredients that is a nod to how gumbo adapted to the limited rations available on those arid islands. But the port of New Orleans and the surrounding landscape, as I mentioned last week, was both a garden spot and a hunter's paradise, and already it had its own rich food culture even before the French and the Germans and the West Africans and the global sailor population started placing their culinary stamp on the place. Thickened meaty stews also existed for the alligator hunting and corn raising locals. And some stews were thickened with ground corn or cracked hominy, but they were also sometimes thickened with the dried ground leaves of the sassafras tree. Yes, the wonder drug of the 16th century in Europe was originally used in the daily life and local cookery of the tribes of the Mississippi Delta. When added at the end of cooking off the heat, filet powder thickens liquids. It turns soup into something much more stew-like, and it causes the liquid to have a particular stringy consistency. The word filet, F-I-L-E accent aigu, is the past participle of the French verb filer, which among other things means thready or ropey, which is where filet powder got its French name. It had a host of other names before the French got there, which have been largely overwritten. But anyway, when you hear the name gumbo filet, that was a term to explain that this gumbo was thickened with the ground dried sassafras. And so it was different from just like gumbo that was thickened with okra. Gumbo. So when the Louisiana weather proved to make okra an annual plant rather than a perennial, when it was time for gumbo, some thickened stew, but no fresh okra was to be found, the ground sassafras, the filet, would do the work of thickening the stew to swallow consistency, which is likely the source of the apparent rule of use okra in gumbos with tomatoes and filet if there's no tomatoes. Because as we advance along gumbo history, we'll see this isn't really a rule exactly, just more of a fact of the times. See, back at this point, okra and tomatoes were just ripe at the same time. One used filet when there was no okra to be had, and generally if there's no okra, it's likely there were also no tomatoes lying around. So this sticky African vegetable stew, as it traveled across the Atlantic and went through the Caribbean, and then into this port city that seemed to be touched by everyone everywhere, gumbo would change and adapt and be something in every house and move with the seasons. In one journal recounting the opera and party season of New Orleans, an evening was recorded where 27 different gumbos were served. So at this stage of the game, when New Orleans is everybody's city to stop over and trade in, gumbo is just a particularly tasty thickened soup. If you're an African, it may start with beef or poultry or seafood as a broth base, depending on whether you're from the north end or the south end of West Africa, or maybe your people hail from the Canary Islands. If you're French, Creole, it should probably always start with pork. But if you're rural Acadian, who's turning Cajun, maybe it's pork, but maybe it's just local game. And if you're Spanish, the version likely starts with some beef, just like the Spanish ollas, their particular sort of flavorful catch-all party stew. Unless maybe you had something else in your pantry. After all, this is all stew, so realistically, it just depended. What went into your thickened stew, your gumbo, often really had more to say about how close to the coast you lived and what season of the year it was, rather than actually giving any useful clue to your social class. Everybody saw these gumbos as a way to use little bits of this or that when it came to the meats included. Something from the farm, something from the swamp, or something from the forest. And if possible, a few delicious oysters from the shore. What really gave class away when it came to gumbo was not what was in it, but what you ate it with. The gumbo-type stews eaten by the Choctaw, Hauma, Biloxi, Chitimacha, Natchez, and other local tribes were commonly consumed with hominy or corn grits. And at this time, the Cajuns living outside the city would also copy this habit, for they grew and milled their own corn on their farms and homesteads outside the port. But in the big city, it was different. The city Creoles, with money to spend and status to show off, would usually eat it with, you guessed it, rice. And there was one more thing the city Creole was starting to do with the arrival of the 19th century and mills. For just that little extra wealth flex, instead of, or in addition to the okra or filet, they would add in a roux. Egg yolks and breadcrumbs were the thickeners of the 17th and 18th centuries and would continue to be so. But if you really wanted to be on the kale Caesar salad fashionable end of things, an 1804 Creole lady in New Orleans would show off by cooking ground wheat flour into pricey seasonal butter and make this new roux thing to thicken her stews. To be au courant, she would make her okra soup by first cooking all the slime out of those gums things, the okra, by simmering it for an hour, and then thicken the meaty broth it went into with her cooked flour and butter roux. Ah yes, and the gumbo of this age, while it did have a wide variety of meats in it, regardless of your place on the social ladder, it tended not to have sausage, because the prevailing sausage at this point was French sausage, which is chopped, not ground, and thus not up to the job of being sliced and put into soup. And andouille, it's not what you think at this point. In 1804, it is still the cleaned but unstuffed pork or beef intestines, what in modern American food terminology would be known as chitlins. In a little while, the Germans will step in here to change that, but right now, 1804, andouille, it's not a sausage. Not yet. Oh, and there's no trinity either, that 3-vegetable base of onion, green pepper, and celery. Here in 1804, both celery and green pepper are rare items. And so if they do show up on a dinner table, they are usually featured separately and definitely not invisible at the base of a stew. Further, they're only available at very limited portions of the year. You can't just go out and get a green pepper in March or whatever. So if you were to see a gumbo of the day, you might recognize it as such. It would be spicy and tasty and thickish, but it would be different. And unless you were particularly wealthy, you'd be eating it over corn grits or maybe rice grits. Rice grits are what is made with the broken rice that was always considered a waste product of the rice pounding operation. So that's the origins of gumbo. It was essentially a thickened vegetable stew that started out with an okra base and had any manner of meat broths and meat bits in it. By the time we get to 1804, gumbo was lots of things, but all of them were thickened somehow and got served along with a side of starch, yams, corn grits, or rice. Now, I also mentioned jambalaya, which is a rice dish. But if rice was only for the best of them, what is going on with jambalaya? So first of all, while some version of the dish definitely existed at this point in New Orleans, and you'll see in a minute why I feel confident saying this, the word jambalaya didn't exist on Three Flags Day in March of 1804. The first, it seems, anyone has found of a written version of the word jambalaya is 1837. But let me explain why I think some version of the dish was surely at the party. While we are all clear that rice had to be imported into most of Europe and was for the fancy people, in Spain it was grown locally. Along with sugar, rice was another crop brought into the Iberian Peninsula during the Arab occupation. Just as Americans imported West African rice growing technology into North America in the 17th century, the Arabs did the same to Spain in the 8th century. But because it was a practice taken up as a livelihood by the residents, rather than as an extractive activity, rice over time in Spain would come closer to being a staple rather than a luxury in the parts of Spain where the climate and the terrain were suited to the grain. And the Spanish grains were of a short, rounded sort, typified in the bomba style of rice, and more suited to a soupy simmer that would develop into the dish that would, around the 1840s, be codified into what we think of when we say paella, both the dish, the pan, the legend. Now, the Spanish Creoles, the criollo, who moved to New Orleans to rule in the late 18th century, were going to New Spain, the most exciting place in the empire with the most exciting port town. And sure, they were in charge, and they got to eat alligator with chili peppers and vinegar and try out this new barbacoa fad, but they also got bit by copperheads, and they missed their mixed rice dishes from home. So in New Orleans, they made something like it, with broth and beans and bits of meat and seafood. But the beans and broth and bits of meat were all different, and so was the rice. Instead of the chunky, round, absorbent bomba style of rice, it was the long grain American rice style that had come by way of Africa. These grains were much longer and more delicate, and they tended to separate rather than sort of hang out together when cooked in the preferred local style, especially when this rice was cooked by the African cooks and their descendants who had come from the rice coast. See, paella is cooked in a wide, flat pan. There's a quick boil to get everyone hot enough to convert the starches, and then it's finished at the simmer, slowly, uncovered. And the rice absorbs the tasty broth until the rice is fully cooked. And then the bottom layer dries out and it toasts. Ideally, you get these tasty, crackly bits at the bottom. And the short, fat rices of the Spanish rice-growing regions are perfect for this. But the style of rice the African cooks were working with, it prefers to be boiled and then steamed in a covered vessel. Instead of a velvety blanket of starchy liquid that sort of holds together the paella rice, the long-grain African rice shows off by being separate and delicate. You can see it today in a properly made jollof. Now, I'm not going to get into exactly what a properly made jollof is beyond rice texture, because that's its own fight or tournament of varying opinions, depending on where your recipe box roots are from. As with gumbo, there are more right answers than wrong ones, but generally it's spicy and sometimes smoky as opposed to the smooth and usually meaty flavors of the paellas. And there's definitely no crispy rice bits like in a paella. What was turning into jambalaya is where the Valencian-style rice cookery crashed into the jollof rice traditions of West Africa that had been rolled through the French Caribbean, and further changed as everyone used the ingredients and tools that were to be found in this global port city of New Orleans. Unlike gumbo, which was a stew that went with starch, jambalayas and their ancestors are rice dishes that have other stuff cooked with the rice. So it's actually closer to a pilaf or a pilau or even a biryani and not a stew at all. So back here at Three Flags Day, March 9th and 10th, 1804, at the acquisition of New Orleans by America, both gumbo and the precursor to jambalaya are heavily African dishes that have been changed by mixing with French and Spanish influences, the local pots and pans and cooking habits, and the local ingredients, the alligators, the oysters, the squirrels, the crabs, the pigs, the cows, the tomatoes and chilies, and the spice blends of everyone's visiting hand will have their say. And so we'll let the styles develop in this maison, in that tavern, as well as the houses that take in boarders for all the ships that are docking on the wharves from all over the world. Of course, I'll be following the evolution of these two dishes, which, in their sources, their adaptation, and their loud proclamations regarding what is the real version, have definitely turned into some of the most American foods of all. As this show goes along, I'll be checking in with them and adding other ones as the American catalog of New Orleans food changes with the moods of America. So next week, since we're in New Orleans anyway, it's time to check in with the pirates and the privateers. I'll group in the smugglers and the slavers for good measure this time. What did these men and women do during these years of war and adventure? The range of items to trade in and the places to trade with and cause mayhem have expanded even more since before the Revolution. I mean, America just bought, the best pirate city. So let's go see what's up. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes lets me know you're out there. But even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least that you find it interesting. You want more food and history in your future? And holy cow, in just 3 weeks from now, November 4th, a Saturday, you can catch me and a whole gaggle of history podcasters at the Intelligent Speech Online Conference. I'll be talking about butter substitutes. I'll be talking about the contingencies women needed when they fell outside the path of the good woman, and some other stuff. Come see me and a whole bunch of other people. Tickets are now available, and I have a discount code. It is FOOD. See me live a few times, and you can even ask me questions. I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength, in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. It's still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud, straight up crime. Lots and lots of crime. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you'll find me in Threads and Insta as @THoAFood because I'm all X'd out. And all this information is available in the show description.
Hey everyone, my name's Sebastian Major, and I am the host of the Our Fake History podcast.
I'm Rebecca Larson with the Tudors Dynasty podcast.
This is Greta Harden. I'm the host of The History of American Food.
Hi, my name is Benjamin Jacobs. I'm the host of Wittenberg to Westphalia, The Wars of the Reformation.
Hello.
I'm Anton.
And I'm Rick. We're the Curiosity of a Child podcast.
I'm David Montgomery, host of The Siècle.
Hi, I'm Bree from Pontifex.
My name is Roberto Toro, and I'm the host of Czar Power and the History of Sakartvelo, Georgia.
Hello, and welcome to Totalis Rankium. I'm Jamie.
And I'm Rob, and this is letting you know that we will be speaking at Intelligent Speech.
I am looking forward to speaking at Intelligent Speech 2023.
And I will be speaking at Intelligent Speech Online this year.
Mark your calendars for this November 4th. Intelligent Speech, the online conference for history fans by history podcasters.
It's a 3-ring circus of fascinating content with around 24 hours of live presentations and roundtables happening in 4 digital rooms.
This year is all about contingencies.
Times when history meets the unexpected.
The topic of my keynote address is No Contingencies, Stories of Historical Figures Who Did Not Have a Backup Plan.
All about the Tudors and their contingency plans. Because, let's be real, they had a lot of them.
So what are we going to be doing?
We're going to be telling the story of what happens when you're starving in a city under siege for months, surrounded by food that you can't eat as it's your life's work, food that's more important than you are.
So go to intelligentspeechonline.com to get your tickets.
We'll see everybody on November 4th.